Hey there, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having an amazing day, and thanks so much for joining me on this one. This video is going to be the third episode of my watercolor pencil flowers series that I'm creating, in which I'm painting different flowers using watercolor pencils and using specific tried and true color schemes that have been used by artists throughout history to create color harmony and an interesting expressive look in their pieces. So far, I have painted a sunflower piece in which I used the square color scheme, and after that I created a piece that included two pink carnations using the Split Complementary color scheme. I'll make sure to leave links to those past tutorials down below in the description box in case you'd like to go and check them out. My objective is to cover all of these very important color schemes that, in my opinion, we should all know about and explore as artists. For today's yellow rose close-up piece, I'm going to be using the analogous color scheme. The analogous color scheme is made up of three colors that are next to each other in the color wheel, and these can be anywhere in the color wheel. Something that I'd recommend doing whenever you're choosing a color scheme for a new piece is thinking of which color you want to be your dominant color, and then making sure that you're using more of that color throughout your piece. This way, you're not using the same amount of every color in your color scheme, and they're not competing against each other. And also, you can use color in a more intentional way to transmit a specific mood, message, idea, story, or emotion in your piece by choosing that color to be your dominant color of the bunch. The way that I like strategizing or planning to make this happen is in the beginning of my painting process, I set a ratio for myself. So perhaps my dominant color is going to be used in 60% of the piece, my secondary color is going to be used in 30% of the piece, and the final tertiary supportive color maybe is going to be used as just an accent or a pop of color in 10% of the piece. Or it can also be a 50-30-20 or a 70-20-10. Whatever you decide, but pick which color you want to be your most important dominant color, and then the others are going to be after that in terms of that hierarchy. So for this yellow rose piece in particular, I knew since the beginning that I would be creating a standalone illustration of a yellow rose with no background to it. And so I'm going to be using this analogous color scheme to create my different values throughout the petals to create a little bit of a realistic look and to give this flower a sense of light and shadow and dimension overall. I went for the approximately 50-30-20 ratio here because I wanted to make sure that my rose looked more so like a yellow rose at the end, and that I didn't go overboard with my darker colors, which in this case would be the yellow orange and the orange. If I did that, then I would risk my rose looking more orange than yellow. I wanted to make sure to keep those darker midtones and darkest dark colors that I would be using for my value development in the darker midtones and darkest dark areas. All right, so the very first thing that I did to prepare to get started with my painting process was the same thing that I did for the last two pieces. I first found a beautiful reference photo, and this one I found over on pexels.com, and it was taken by photographer Poliana Francisca de Araujo. I'll make sure to leave a link to this photo down below in the description box where you're going to be able to download it and work on this piece on your own. I downloaded the photo and did quite a bit of editing to it in Photoshop. So for this one, I flipped the photo horizontally. I then tilted the photo or rotated the photo slightly because I wanted to create more of an asymmetrical look to the outer shape of the flower, the outer contour. I separated the flower from its background because I wasn't going to be adding a background to this piece. I played with the brightness and the contrast a little bit and saved two different versions of this photo for myself. A full color version and also a grayscale or desaturated or black and white photo. Just like with the other watercolor pencil processes that I've included in this series, I also worked off the black and white photo as I was working on this piece. And this is because with these color scheme exercises, I don't necessarily have to go with the colors present in the photo. I can actually change them. I could have painted this rose in reds or in purples and just took the values that I saw present in the black and white photo, and it would still look realistic because I am making those values happen. Value is number one when it comes to developing mid to higher levels of realism. Value goes above or is even more important than color correctness when trying to achieve depth and realism and three-dimensionality in a piece. You can bring in more expressive and even a natural use of color, and if you respect those values that are present in the reference photo or whatever it is that you have in front of you in real life, you're still going to be able to achieve a certain level of depth and volume and realism, as long as you're really pinpointing those different values, the lights, the midtones, and the darkest darks, present in that reference, and you're making them happen to the best of your abilities in your artwork. By using a photo that is turned into a grayscale photo or black and white photo, it's much easier to pinpoint those different values or tones present in that reference photo, because instead of having lots and lots of different color scales going from lights to darks for all of these different colors, all of the different colors have been unified and turned into one same scale from white to black or black to white. Not to mention, if you're working off of a grayscale photo, if you want to change any of those colors that are present in the original full colored photo, you can go ahead and change them. You're not going to be influenced by the colors present in that reference. And that can be a wonderful thing when you're doing color explorations like the ones that we're doing with these color scheme exercises. And I've definitely changed colors in the past flower exercises that I've shared with you, but for this particular one, I really wanted to keep this rose yellow because I remember sharing a watercolor pencil tutorial a very long time ago, years ago, of a yellow rose, and lots of people seemed to really like it. So I wanted to make a new and improved version of a yellow rose using watercolor pencils to share with you guys. I brought out my color wheel once again, like I've been doing for the episodes in this series. And I chose the 3 specific colors that I would be using for this analogous color scheme, which would be the yellow orange, and the orange. After deciding on those 3 colors, I then chose the specific watercolor pencils that I would be using for my Gold Faber Aqua set from Faber-Castell. Using those 3 colors present in my color wheel as reference, I took out the colors that were most similar to those from my set. And what I am doing right here is I am swatching out these colors on a scrap piece of watercolor paper so that I know what they look like on paper. I test them out dry, and then I bring in a paintbrush and a little bit of water to do a little bit of color activation. And this is important because I am actually planning to do some color activation throughout my painting process. And watercolor pencils can definitely surprise us. Colors can look a lot brighter, a lot darker, or different from what we expected when they get activated with water. So it's very smart to swatch them out in both dry and activated form, especially if you're planning on bringing in water throughout the painting process. Okay, so that is it. All I'm going to be using are these 3 colors for this entire piece. So we're going to keep it simple, but this doesn't mean that we're not going to be able to create higher levels of realism. I'm going to tell you all about my layering process and how I do this. So the specific colors that I use for my Gold Faber Aqua set are cadmium yellow, dark chrome yellow, and dark cadmium orange. You by no means have to use these exact same colors that I'm going to be using. As long as you use a yellow orange, and an orange, you're going to do great. Which, by the way, my orange is leaning a little bit more towards the red orange, but that's totally fine. I wanted to make sure that there was a good difference between my 3 colors so that one of them could be my lighter color, the other could be the medium color, and the other could be the darkest color. This would set me up for success in order to develop a nice range of values from very light areas to very dark areas so that I could create the depth and the dimension that I wanted to create. And if you're interested in knowing what specific type and size of paintbrush I'm going to be using to do my color activation, all I'm going to be using for this process is a size 3 round brush. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with phase number 1 of this watercolor pencil process. This is the initial layering that we're going to be doing using our lightest color and our medium color. So in this case, our lightest color is the yellow, and our medium color that we're going to be using after the yellow is the yellow orange. I always get started with the lightest color of the bunch, and I make my way incrementally towards the darker color. So what I am doing right here is I am creating my initial layer of yellow. I am not pressing down hard at all on my paper. I don't want to start scratching or burnishing my paper, and I am just starting to apply that pigment on paper gently. As you can see, I am leaving certain sections of that paper shining through completely uncovered with this yellow, and this is because those are going to be my highlight areas. So when we're painting with watercolor or watercolor pencils, it is very helpful to incorporate that whiteness or that brightness of the paper as our highlights. We bring that paper in as part of the piece. This is how we create light paintings that seem to glow from within. We don't need to bring in white paint, white watercolor pencil, or whatever it is to create our highlights, because all we need to do is plan for them and keep them protected throughout the painting process. So I am getting ideas from that reference photo, trying to notice where lightest value areas are, and I am simply avoiding placing any pigment or laying down color in those highlight areas because I want that whiteness of the paper to be left alone and shining through. I am leaving those areas uncovered with any pigment. So for the most part, the highlight shapes that I am leaving free of pigment are in different places along the outer edges of my petals, where I perceive those sections to be catching most of the light in that reference photo. I am working petal by petal, section by section, and I'm slowly making my way in towards the central section of the flower. I am not allowing myself to get stuck in any single area, nor am I looking to create a carbon copy of my reference photo. I am just using it for clues as to where my different values should be developed. As I am making my way in, these shapes become smaller and smaller, and it gets more difficult to keep little highlight shapes. It also gets super easy to get lost with all of those little shapes and the overlapping taking place in that central section of the flower. But again, I don't allow myself to get stuck there, and I know that as long as I communicate the general idea for this overlapping in here as I continue developing my different values, and I have that structure in mind for the flower and how light and shadow works, I can use my artistic license and leave things out and bring things in. I could even remove petals or bring in an extra petal or change the shape of a petal. And this is still going to look realistic at the end. So there's no need to get overwhelmed or be super perfectionistic about getting every single thing exactly as it appears in the photo. As long as you communicate the general idea, you have the structure of the flower in mind and how light and shadow works, how different petals would be covering each other up and creating shadows on each other, and you develop your values, your lights, your midtones, your darkest darks mindfully, then at the end, the result will be believable. After I was done with that initial light application of my lightest color, which is my yellow, all throughout the flower, I am going back in with a second layer of yellow. This time, I'm pressing down just a little bit harder. I'm still not burnishing my paper at all, but I'm looking to start overlapping more pigment, especially in darkest areas that I'm going to be developing. So I'm constantly observing that reference photo, and I am getting clues and ideas as to where the darker midtones are throughout these petals. The majority of these darker midtones are, of course, in the inner section of that petal where there is more overlapping taking place and shadows created. That's where I am layering a little bit more of this yellow. It's important that as you make your way out from that darkest area, that you exert a less amount of pressure on your pencil. You don't want to start getting way too much pigment in lightest value areas or start covering up your highlights where you want that paper to be left alone, shining through, completely uncovered. If you start placing way too much pigment way too close to the highlight areas, When it comes time to do your activation of color with a little bit of water and a paintbrush, it's very likely that you're going to cover up those highlights because you have so much pigment so close to the highlight. So make sure that those lightest value sections are left with little to no pigment on them. In other words, the closer you get to your highlight section, the lighter the application of color should be. Throughout this entire process, something that is key is keeping in mind that you are doing the majority of that layering and saturation of color and placement of pigment in darkest value areas, and lightest value areas have little to no pigment on them. Okay, so after doing my 2 layers with the yellow, it was time to switch on over to my next color, which is the yellow orange. And when it comes to the yellow orange, I'm focusing on only applying it and layering it in darker mid-tone areas and in darkest dark areas. As you can see, I am leaving all of the highlights where I wanted to keep that brightness of the paper protected with no pigment, as well as the lighter value areas where I've just applied that previous yellow color in the outer sections of the petals. And all I am doing is I'm doing overlapping of this yellow orange in the inner sections and the sections that I'm looking to darken a little bit more. It really helps to go in with a well-sharpened pencil, especially when you're working in that inner section of the flower. So I would recommend constantly sharpening your watercolor pencils throughout the painting process. I am continuing to observe that reference photo and taking clues as to where darker midtones and darkest dark areas are, and this is where I am placing my yellow orange, making sure that I'm not going overboard with the amount of this color because, again, I don't want to accidentally start making this rose look more orange than yellow. So I'm making sure to focus the addition or the layering of this color in those darker areas that I see in the reference photo. And there are certain areas where there are petal folds or curves in those petal structures along the outer section of the petal that have a little bit of a darker midtone. I do my best to observe that reference photo closely and capture those subtle changes in value as best as I can. And if I notice darker midtones in the outer portions of the petals, I try to at least make them happen. This is important because this is an organic, irregular object that we are painting here, and capturing those subtle changes in values here and there can really communicate more of a believable look. I'm applying this yellow orange in those sections as well, but perhaps doing so a little bit more lightly without pressing down too hard at all. I'm still not really pressing down very hard or trying to burnish anything, but where I perceive darkest dark values, I can go ahead and look to cover up that tooth of that paper a little bit more by pressing down slightly harder than what I would do in lighter value areas where I want to leave more of that paper shining through. After finishing up with my layering of yellow orange, I went back to the yellow to do a little bit more layering with this color. I did a few things here. I made certain large highlight areas a little bit smaller, and I also did a little bit of layering of my yellow over my yellow orange and softened transitions between my two colors a little bit more. And this is how slowly but surely you create a lot of dimension and a lot of depth by incorporating that brightness and whiteness of the paper under the pigment and really making sure that you are observing value present in that reference photo and thinking of the actual three-dimensional structure of what it is that you are painting. All right, so after that initial layering of color, it was time to get started with phase number 2 of this process, which is going to be our first activation of color. I brought out my container with clean water, I brought out my size 3 round brush, and my absorbent towel. It's super important to have some sort of absorbent towel on hand or a regular kitchen paper towel, but it is imperative to have something on hand that is going to help you stay on top of water control. You're going to notice that I'm constantly touching the tip of my paintbrush onto my absorbent towel to remove that excess water, that excess drippage before going into my painting. When you're painting with watercolor pencils, you really don't have to go in with very much water at all. A little bit of water goes a long way, and you don't want to start dripping water all over the place or start losing control. Every time I go into my container of water, I remove the excess water by gently scraping the bristles along the top of my container there, and or dabbing the tip of my paintbrush on my absorbent towel before going into my painting. You can see how as I am doing my color activation, the yellow especially is becoming super bright. My yellow and my orange are starting to blend together a lot better, and I'm getting much more of a painterly effect. As I am doing my color activation, I am making sure to keep my highlights protected still. You can still see how I have little sections, especially along the outer edges of my petals, where I have the whiteness of the paper shining through unpainted. And you can even start noticing at this point how slowly but surely these are looking more and more like highlights. So a couple of things that are going to help you tremendously when you're activating that color with water. The first is work petal by petal and focus on activating, gently gliding the damp bristles of your paintbrush along the lightest area first and make your way towards the darker area of the petal. This is very helpful because if you do it the other way around, you're going to start pulling or pushing that darker color into highlight areas or lighter value areas, which are going to cover up or get rid of those lighter value areas. If you do it the other way around, because those lighter value areas have much less pigment in them and have a lighter color in them as well, you may pull that lighter color into the darker areas, but the lighter color is not going to quote unquote eat up the darker color, whereas the darker color can very easily eat up the lighter color. So try doing your activation from lighter areas towards darker areas. And key point number 2 when you're doing your color activation is pay attention to how much pigment is collecting in your paintbrush bristles, because as you continue doing your activation of color, that pigment starts collecting in your paintbrush bristles and you can accidentally start covering up your highlight areas or adding too much yellow orange into the very light yellow value areas and pushing and pulling pigment around, and you start losing control. So as you can see here, I am constantly dipping my paintbrush in my container of water and removing that pigment from my paintbrush bristles before going back in to do my activation in my next section or my next petal. It is very important that you keep observing how you're moving around that pigment on the paper when you're doing your color activation, and always keep value in mind. Keep observing that reference photo and keep noticing the value development that you've already done, because you don't want to start flattening anything out and completely ruining the value development that you've already started. Because you're pushing and pulling that pigment around on the paper, you may start making those highlight shapes smaller, and that is okay. I kind of expect this to happen already, and so this is why in the beginning I leave larger highlight sections of paper uncovered, because I know that they're bound to get smaller along the way. But I do want to make sure that I keep highlights in those areas where I initially planned them as much as possible. Keep them protected throughout the painting process. Alright, so I'm all done with that initial activation of color, and you can see how everything looks a lot brighter and a lot more painterly. I allowed everything to dry completely, and you can help yourself with a hair dryer if you want to speed up that drying process. But for me, it is very important that everything is completely dry before getting started with phase number 3, because damp paper is not going to take that layering of pigment the same way as dry paper will. And I certainly don't want to start damaging my paper with the sharp tips of my pencils. Remember that wet paper is fragile paper, and we need to allow it to dry so that it can regain its strength in between applications of color. Okay, so the objective with this phase, which is phase number 3, is to deepen and darken darker midtones and darkest dark areas. Because I'm focusing on my darker midtones and darkest darks, I'm really only going to be using my medium color and my darkest color that I picked for this piece, which are the yellow orange and the orange or the red orange. So as you can see by this point in the process, I have highlight areas where I have that brightness of the paper shining through. I also have very light areas that look like a more pale translucent yellow where I applied that pigment in a very thin layer. And then I have other sections where that yellow looks a little bit more saturated and is starting to turn into orange. So what I am doing now is I am pushing those orange sections and those shadow sections by applying more of my yellow orange in those sections, making sure that I am releasing that pressure as I am moving out of those areas and into the lighter value areas so that I can create gradients or transitions from orange into yellow. I'm not really looking to add any more color or do any more layering in lighter value areas, and I'm still staying mindful of highlight areas so that I can keep protecting them throughout this process. I also want to make sure that I don't go overboard with this application of yellow-orange because I want to make sure that I have plenty of those brighter yellow tones shining through. Otherwise, as I said, I'm going to end up making this rose look more orange than yellow. All right, so it is time to bring in my darkest color of the bunch, which is my orange, but this dark cadmium orange really looks like a reddish orange. And you're going to notice that I am applying this red orange in only the very darkest dark sections that I'm looking to push more. So the darker I get with my colors, the more I want to make sure that I'm only placing that color where I'm really looking to push darkest dark areas. And the smaller the shapes that I am coloring in are, the darker that I get. This is how you develop that wide range of values. I'm pushing that contrast and carving out those darkest darks, so to speak. And this widens that range of values, which makes this look even more realistic. As I am coloring in these darkest sections, I am again making sure to loosen up that pressure that I'm exerting on my pencil as I am making my way out into lighter midtones. I don't want this color in lightest value sections. And as I'm moving into the darker tones here, I am working even more quickly because, as I said, these shapes that I'm coloring in are pretty small. I'm only looking to layer this darkest color in smaller, darkest dark shadow sections that I'm looking to push even more. When it comes to using watercolor pencils, as I've shared in past tutorials and tips videos, which I would highly recommend checking out my watercolor pencil 101 video. It's a very thorough video in which I share the must-know information, must-know techniques, lots of information on the paper that I like to work on and why, etc. And also how watercolor pencils compare to traditional watercolor paint. I'll make sure to leave a link to that down below in the text section of this post in case you'd like to go and check it out. But what I was getting at is when I use watercolor pencils, I like using the medium at its full capacity and balancing out painterly effects with a sketchier look and texture that can only be developed via pencil application. I think this is the beauty of this medium, and what sets it apart from other mediums is that this is a drawing and a painting medium all wrapped up together into one. So with all this in mind, this is how I arrived at my own way of working, in which at the end, I incorporate both painterly effects with sketchier effects. This leads to a very interesting, well-balanced look. Okay, so after doing that second application of color using my medium color, which is the yellow-orange, and also the darkest color, which is my orange or red orange, it was time to work on my second activation of color using water and a paintbrush. And this is going to be the last activation of color that I do for this piece. The same things apply that I was mentioning with the first activation of color. You want to be super careful and mindful of how you're pushing and pulling that pigment on your paper, and that you're noticing how much color is collecting in your paintbrush bristles so that you can rinse out that paintbrush whenever you need to. Make sure that you are activating from lightest areas towards the darker areas because you don't want to pull that reddish color into the yellow sections, because this is going to make your rose look red and no longer yellow. And you can also risk ruining or messing up the value development that you worked so hard on. This second activation is going to be much quicker though, because I'm really only activating those sections where I just placed my yellow-orange and my reddish-orange. Right here, I want to show you how I fix a little mistake that I make. So I go in and accidentally pull some of that reddish-orange into a light yellow area right around here. There you go. You can see that streak there. All I did was remove that color from my paintbrush bristles, and I went in with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush, and I ran my paintbrush bristles over that pigment that was still wet, and I was able to soften that out and almost completely erase it. It's just a matter of noticing when this happens and then moving quickly, removing that paint from your paintbrush bristles and going back in to lift that up with your absorbent towel or soften it by running your paintbrush bristles over it. Okay, so I continue jumping around, making my way in, and you can see how I'm being a little bit more careful as I make my way into this centralmost section with these very small shapes. I want to make sure that I at least keep some lightest highlights along the edges of those petals in that inner section. I allowed everything to dry completely after my color activation, and I took a quick second to erase out some of my visible pencil lines that I was able to see along the edges of my drawing. If the pencil work has been covered with pigment and that pigment has been activated, then it's very likely that you're not going to be able to erase it. But I had some pencil work visible along the outer edges where I have some highlights that didn't have any pigment in them. So I took a little break to erase those out, and I did make sure that my eraser was nice and clean before going into my painting because I didn't want to dirty anything up. All right, we are officially in the very last phase of this painting process, which is the final application of color with our watercolor pencils. So in this phase, I am going to be using all three colors. And I'm not going to be activating this because, as I said, I like incorporating that sketchiness and that texture that watercolor pencils allow, and balancing that out with the more painterly effects that we achieved via the color activation. So the objective with this last phase of this process is to create a little bit more of a sketchier look that I like, but also to do our final pushing of darkest dark areas, especially using the medium color, which is the yellow orange, and the darkest color of the bunch, which is the reddish orange. We can also work on transitions between darker value areas and lighter value areas. If you see any very dark shapes or areas that immediately turn into very light areas, perhaps you want to work on those transitions in between the two. So make sure that you're picking the right color for that area and that you're exerting less pressure as you make your way out towards the lighter value sections. Another thing that I'm going to do in this part of the process is I'm going to be bringing in my yellow, which is the lightest, brightest color of the bunch. And I'm going to do some light layering with this brightest color to brighten that yellow up. And finally, the last thing that I'm also going to do in this last part of the process is you're gonna see me add a little bit of definition and upping the contrast along some of the outer edges of the petals here and there. And this is because since my background is completely white and I have lots of highlight sections along the edges there, adding this little bit of definition along the outer edges can really make the flower pop. And for this, I'm going to be using my lightest colors. So my yellow and my yellow orange, unless that outer section of the petal is very, very dark. But it is important that if you are going to be defining outer edges around your petals, that you only go over certain sections and you stay away from creating outlines around your petals. Outlines can really lead to flatness and to more of a cartoony look. And so if you want this piece to look a little bit more on the realistic side, I would highly recommend making sure that you're not creating obvious, stark looking outlines around any of your petals. Just go over certain sections of those edges of the petals lightly and loosely if you want to add a little bit more definition. Something that always helps me when I'm trying to create more of a believable look is acknowledging all of these different value shapes that I'm developing, the highlights, the midtones, the darkest dark shapes, as abstract, irregular shapes, and everything within this as being shapes and not lines. Okay, so I'm almost done here. This is the yellow in my hand right now, just brightening up certain sections. And at this point, you can see how I've developed a wide range of values using just 3 different colors. I have my highlights where I have that brightness of the paper shining through completely uncovered with pigment. I have very light value areas that I created with my yellow. I have mid-tone areas that I created with my medium color, which is my yellow orange. And I have darkest dark areas that I created by doing more layering and using my red orange. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did, and if so, make sure to check out everything that I am offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real-time, meaning they are not sped up or edited. They are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops. All have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint-along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine. All right, you guys, that is going to do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.